Hi, I'm Kathleen from Cowden Quilt School. This video is for anyone who has already taken my 2-day beginners patchwork and quilting workshops with me. At the end of your second day, you left all set to hand quilt your first patchwork creation. Now that you've got that done, you're ready to turn your mini quilt into a cushion cover and to add the binding. To do that, this video will remind you of everything we learned on the workshop so that you can feel confident doing that yourself from home. Let's get started. So, your quilt sandwich should now look something like this, with your hand stitches holding all 3 layers securely together. And that means we can go ahead and remove any of our last basting pins that we had, keeping those together temporarily. Once we've done that, we can then trim down our wadding and backing fabric so that it is just a little bit wider all the way around than our patchwork top. We're going to aim, as we always do, for about 1/4 inch difference. I'm going to do that with large dressmaking scissors, but you can do that with any scissors you have or a rotary cutter. It doesn't really matter. The raw edges are going to be sealed away eventually within our binding. So here we go. So a very rough 1/4 inch all the way around to get rid of the excess. That will leave us with a little bit of bulk in the edges with it that will end up within our binding and give us a nice plump bound finish to our cushion. And last side. There we are. Now, we're ready to add our envelope cushion backs that we made at the workshop last time. So what we're going to do is flip our quilt over so that the right side is facing down, and we're going to bring in the back pieces that we made and that we hemmed last time, and we're going to lay those out right sides facing up towards us. You want to roughly make sure that the outer edges line up with the sandwich as we've just made it, and that the inner hemmed edges overlap in the middle to form our envelope where our cushion stuffing will go. If you need to, you can trim down your envelope back pieces so that they're more or less equivalent to your quilt sandwich, but here that's about right. And then I'm going to go ahead, take some pins and pin all of those layers together all the way around the piece so that we're ready to sew. As we sew, we're going to aim again, as we always do, for more or less 1/4 inch seam from taking it from this side, from the edge, very edge of our patchwork piece inwards. And we want to keep that as scant as possible so that the sewing line gets consumed within the binding when we attach that later on. Okay, so now I have my envelope back pieces attached all the way around to my quilt back, and there's my envelope entry there where the cushion pad will go in due course. Now I attach that all the way around using the walking foot on my sewing machine, which makes light work of all of those layers. But you can do that by hand, of course. You just need to be mindful of protecting your fingers, maybe use a thimble or tape up the ends of your fingers so that they don't get too sore working through all of those layers. We'll take another look at a walking foot on the machine in a little while. So now we're ready to lay out our binding that you made last time at the workshop. It'll look something like this. And we're going to get that ready and in place so that we can attach it. Now the most important thing to remember now is that you want the raw edges of the binding, so this open edge, not the folded edge, to line up with the outer edge of the quilt sandwich. And you want that to be more or less in line with the edge of your patchwork top and more or less straight. So start part way along one side, it doesn't matter which side, and lay get that laid out and ready. When you reach a corner, remember that what we do at this point is flip our binding back over itself in one direction to form a kind of triangle here, and then we bring it back down on itself so that in effect we've just turned the corner, and we can send the binding off down in this direction. Continue all the way around. Where you meet a seam in your binding, where we join strips together like this one here, if I open that out you can see the seam. We need to make sure, if we can, that those seams don't end up sitting within or close to the mitered corner piece, because that's just going to create lots of extra bulk and will make it very difficult to sew through. So if that happens, just shuffle your binding around a little bit, adjust it until you're happy that it goes all the way around without meeting the seams, and you've got 4 nice neat mitered corners at the ready. Once you're ready, take your pins and pin that down and in place. Now make sure you pin close to the folded edge, so this edge here, which leaves you a nice clear run to sew along, especially if you're using the machine. So just show you what I mean, if I put a pin in along there, and I will continue along. When you get to the mitered corner, just make sure you pop a pin in to keep that nice neat fold exactly where you want it. So perhaps pop a pin in on the diagonal like that. And then you can carry on round, all the way round until you get to the end. You will end up with, and we'll see in a minute, 2 long or 1 long flap of extra binding at this end. Do not cut that off, we're going to need that in a little while. Okay, so my binding is now attached all the way around firmly with pins, and we're going to bring it into the machine if you're using a machine, with a walking foot if you've got one. As I say, it will make light work of working through all of those layers. If not, you can do this by hand, but again, just remember about protecting your fingers. We're going to start a little way in from where we first pinned one end of our binding, so that's a good 5 or 6 inches in. And I'm going to show you how to take this along and then how to turn around the corner. So we bring our needle in, and I'm going to sew until I approach this corner here. I'm going to take the pin out, flip the mitre over and get to 1/4 inch away from the edge of the binding here, and I'll stop there and talk you through it. So pin out, flip over that way. I'm just going to stick my pin more or less where I think I'm aiming for. And there, I'm 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. At this point, if you're using a machine, we need to bring our needle in, bring the foot up, and take the quilt round so that we're then able to bring the foot down again and back stitch to take us off the edge of the quilt. At this point, we can come off the machine, and you can see how we've come along this edge here, we've come off here, and we can flip the mitre corner back over again, and when we come back in, we're going to start again at this point here and set off in the other direction, like this. So back in, and the needle down to where we need to be, about 1/4 inch in from the back, and off we go. Now, I'm going to stop there and bring that out so I can show you. But what we have now is the mitre sewn on either side to 1/4 inch and off in the other direction, so when we're ready that will fold over and form a lovely neat mitered corner. So you can go ahead now and carry on all the way around until you've done all 4 corners, until you get to about an equivalent distance away from the other end of the binding strip. So we want to make sure we've got a good amount of space in the middle to play with for the next bit to join them together. Okay, so I have now attached my binding all the way around the quilt top, but I've still got my 2 loose ends that we haven't trimmed yet. So now we need to make those fit exactly so that then we have perfect binding all the way around our piece. So at this point we've got a good amount of overlap between the two, and about halfway between where they meet we're going to trim one or other, it doesn't matter which, but trim one or other a little bit off so that it meets in the middle. Take that away. Then what we want to make sure, I've done that on the top piece, is that our bottom piece is trimmed to 1/2 inch of overlap, and that's going to allow for our seam allowance. So I'm confident there that I've got 1/2 inch, so I'm going to fold that bit back and trim along this edge here just carefully. Take your time because we don't want to over trim at this point. Okay, so now we've got our 2 pieces a little bit shorter and they overlap by 1/2 inch. What we need to do next is to take each edge and open up the fold in our binding. And this is where it gets a tiny bit fiddly, but we need to bring those 2 pieces together, right sides facing, so the rest of our piece will flop up like that with it, and line them up as best we can so that we can pop 1 or 2 needles in place there and make our sewing line along the to join the 2 sides. So I've got 1 pin in there. I'm going to try and put another one in because this has a habit of moving around a bit, so I want to try and keep it nice and stable. There we are. So now I've got the 2 sides, right side facing, pinned together. I'm going to take that off to my machine and sew 1/4 inch again along this line here so that those bits of binding are now attached. So I've just sewn my 1/4 inch seam line here, so I can take my pins back out and use just my fingers to open up that seam and press with your thumbs or fingers, press it down so that it stays open. Then we can fold the binding back over itself again, and lo and behold, it will fit perfectly now to what's left of the gap in our quilt. So at this point all we need to do is again pop some pins in close to the fold line on the inside edge of the binding so that we can finish off that last length to attach our binding all the way along here. At this point, because this is the very last bit of sewing we're going to do, it might help to put an extra back stitch at both ends just to keep everything nice and secure, and then we'll be ready to flip over and attach to the back edge. Okay, so now we're ready. We've joined our binding on the front side of our piece. Now we're going to flip it over and attach it by hand to the back using what we call an invisible slip stitch. So before I get started, what I've just done is snip off the very corner ends of each corner of the piece so that there's not too much bulk in there. And then we are going to flip the binding over, fold it over, so that it covers up our last sewing lines from joining the envelope backing on and whatever else we've been doing to the piece as we've gone along. And then we're going to hold those in place with our wonder clips, which you have from the workshop, and keep it in the right place so that we're ready to sew. And then I'm going to remind you how to work the invisible slip stitch and how to handle the corner. If you find the binding feels quite bulky at this point, then you can always remove the clips and trim the edges a little bit more so that you've got a more comfortable padding in the binding. This feels okay, So I'm going to press on. Okay, so then we're going to take any thread and needle that you feel comfortable with, but we're going to try and choose a colour which coordinates well with the fabric we've chosen for the binding. Don't worry too much about the fabric that you have for your envelope back pieces. It's more important that this thread works with the binding fabric than with the backing fabric. So at this stage, what I'm going to do is remove my first clip so that I can bring the needle in through the raw edges of the fabric so that I can hide the end. Now I've double knotted the end of the thread. I'm not taking my needle through all the way to the other side. I'm just wiggling it around inside the wadding as we do when we're hand quilting and bringing it out just underneath where the fold of the binding will come down. And bring that through. Now that's nice and secure. That means I can fold my binding back down. Just going to make sure that wadding is stuffed away a bit more tightly. And replace my clips where I want them. Then I can bring my needle up through the very edge, very edge of that binding fold and make a stitch there. And then take it back down into the backing fabric, which in our case is the envelope back of the cushion, and take it around about 1 centimetre along here to come out and catch again just the edge of the binding strip and pull it through. What we end up with then are these nice neat little tucks where we are attaching the binding to the back nice and securely. So I'm going to carry on doing that along again by another centimetre or so, pull it taut, keep going. Now as I approach the end, I'm actually going to keep sewing until I reach more like the end of the strip on this edge, and that's just going to mean that I know that I'm nice and secure before I make the fold in my binding and bring it down the other side. I'm going to bring it back then to the corner, more or less where I started, and just pop a little safety stitch in there so that I'm holding everything in the right place. Then I can start turning the corner. I don't worry too much about loose threads at this stage, but you can kind of use this opportunity to tuck them in, because once our binding turns the corner, they're going to be consumed forever and we'll never see them again. So I'm going to turn the corner, making sure that we've got a nice neat seam of our mitre here. Mine feels just a little bit bulky, so I might see if I can just trim an extra little bit off the edge there. There we go. Tighten those stitches back up and fold back over again. At this point it's really helpful to stick one of your clips over the corner, holding it exactly in place where you want it to be. Make sure your stitches are pulled nice and taut at this point. You can take another safety stitch just through the length of binding going this way to capture it in the corner where you want it to be, and then we can carry on our way exactly the same with exactly the same method, but now we've turned the corner and we're heading off in the other direction. And what we'll find if we flip back to the other side is that we've got a nice neat mitre join, no stitching showing on this side, and a lovely neat finished binding piece. Continue all the way around until you get back to where you started. When you get there, you're going to bury your knot inside the quilt, exactly as we did when we were hand quilting. So to remind you, you want to bring your needle in, wriggle it around inside the wadding and the backing pieces, but not bringing it out through the front. Bring your needle through, away from the edges, put it really quite taut so that you can make a knot. And at that point I would recommend a double knot, because this is our very last stitch that's going to hold everything in place. Which we can then snip off and pop the thread back through so it's disappeared and is invisible. And then you will be all done. And that's all there is to it. Well done. Get everything finished off. I hope that video has recapped everything that you remember from the workshops, and don't forget to send me a photo when you're all done.